Yeah, so I want to talk about the N-word. You know, the N-word, people think back to the civil rights movements, they think about discrimination, and today we have a new discrimination, a new division in society. But it's not about putting people in the back of the bus. It's not about people suffering from apartheid in South Africa. It's about interest rates. So if you're Mark Zuckerberg, for example, the cost of borrowing on your mortgage is 1%. If you're part of the new N-word, and I'm part of the new N-word, you're part of the new N-word, then our cost of funds is 20%. If you're Mark Zuckerberg, what you get on your savings or on your investments, trading and inside information, market manipulation, you can expect 20, 25%. Us, the new N-words, what do we get? We get 0%. And this is the new discrimination. This is the new apartheid. It's down along lines of the interest rate curve, and it is impoverishing this generation and obliterating savers, workers, and pensioners by design, using not political gerrymandering or discrimination, but interest rates. And this is what this LIBOR scandal is all about, and all the interest rate scandals are all about, and what the Bank of England is all about, what the central banks are all about, what the banks on Wall Street are all about discrimination using interest rates to disenfranchise an entire generation and go back to neo-feudalism, or the old feudalism, call it neo-feudalism, Stacey.
Well, the N-word you're talking about is, of course, NIRP, negative interest rate policy, and we see that around the world. We see negative interest rates in Germany, at negative interest rates in Switzerland, in Finland, in Denmark, you know, it's everywhere.
Right, that's an attack on savers by going into negative interest rates that you actually have to pay the bank money to hold on to your funds, and you get less back at the end of 1 year or 2 years. That's a vicious, orchestrated attack using financial weapons, financial terrorism, which again is rearing its ugly head throughout this week's news cycle. Once again, we see financial terrorists in the news.
Well, we see them in this first headline here, Max. Pair hired to clean up Irish banks named in U.S. scandal. The U.S. scandal is actually the U.S. crime that HSBC committed of laundering money for the various terrorist groups and cartels around the world. The government of Ireland faces huge embarrassment today. Oh, we're so embarrassed. We've hired some financial terrorists. After two key figures appointed to help clean up the Irish financial system were named in an explosive U.S. investigation into global banking giant HSBC. Chairman of state-owned AIB, David Hodgkinson, and Michael Noonan's top NAMA advisor, Michael Gagan, are both named in a 330-page report that follows an investigation into HSBC by a U.S. Senate subcommittee set up in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York.
Right, after 9/11. And of course, so you had probably HSBC bankers working in the Twin Towers, financing terrorists, quote unquote, that in turn came down and knocked those buildings down and killed the HSBC bankers. But funded by their own, hoisted by their own petard, they funded the very acts that destroyed them. That's why it's a misnomer to say that everyone perishing that day is, quote unquote, innocent. A lot of those bankers were financing the Saudis who ended up coming back and attacking the towers. And is that poetic? Well, I leave it up to history to decide.
Well, after the suicide bombing in Damascus this week, Donald Rumsfeld, former minister in his office, praised it. He called it a martyr event. He said this is the first suicide bombing we should call a martyr event. So the same thing could be said if you look in the Treasury Department. Are they saying these sort of suicide bombings are okay, that these sort of reckless destroying of the global economy is a martyr event?
Oh, Bob Diamond is a suicide banker. Jamie Dimon is a suicide banker. Lloyd Blankfein is a suicide banker. They're willing to blow themselves and their institutions up in the name of an ideology, market fundamentalism, with the precept of infinite growth and to obliterate millions using interest rate apartheid. That's their ideology. They're terrorists.
Well, in fact, Max, it's just a little game, apparently, according to this story. HSBC is accused of playing fast and loose with U.S. banking rules. Now, any normal person, 99.9999999% of you out there, if you played fast and loose with banking rules, believe me, you would be in jail for thousands of years in some cases.
Right, well, HSBC, okay, they were laundering money for a drug cartel in Mexico. Also remember Wachovia, now part of Wells Fargo. They were caught laundering $400 billion for Mexican drug cartels. They didn't deny it. They paid a small fine. HSBC will pay a small fine. And they're financing Saudis to commit acts of terror. And then America spends money on the war on terror. So the savers get penalized twice. They get taxed to pay for the war on terror. They get the same banks that are being subsidized by the government, which is in league with the bankers, in league with the terrorists, to finance confiscation of wealth using interest rate apartheid. And they wonder why there's a revolution brewing.
So HSBC is accused of playing fast and loose with U.S. banking rules between 2004 and 2010 by U.S. Senator Carl Levin, a key ally of U.S. President Barack Obama, who chaired the team that published the report. Top NAMA advisor Michael Gagan was HSBC's most senior executive for almost the entire period now under investigation. The current AIB chairman was the bank's chief operating officer between 2006 and 2008, and before that ran its Middle East business. So these two men are in charge now of cleaning up the Irish financial system, which was more than any other situation in Europe, was a financial crime scene. And they brought in two of the capo de capos involved in one of the biggest crimes here that HSBC was engaged in. They're supposed to be cleaning up this mess.
Right, but they're at real risk of blowing themselves up and the people around them because they also finance terrorists, as we know from the HSBC case. So don't go on any airplanes with bankers. If you see a banker going on an airplane, you'll see them with a briefcase and Gucci loafers, okay? Those are the terrorists. Don't get on that plane.
Well, all these recidivist criminals, banking criminals, operate out of London. Grim Britain, where problem families cost taxpayers up to £250,000. And Max, we're not talking about the families, those crime families of the Diamonds and the Greens of the world. No, we're talking about the poor people. The country's most troubled families will be forced to undergo a £10,000 program to break the cycle of their dreadful backgrounds. As it has emerged, one problem family had cost the council £250,000. So the respect czar, Louise Casey, says, "We have looked at a little bit of Britain, which is grim, which is stark. This hasn't sadly come overnight. This has gone through generation after generation. I don't think this has to happen in society for the families who had to live next door to them, to the teachers who have to teach their kids in the school, to the people who are the victims of crime. We can't let them continue like that. Financially, we can't carry on as we are. There is a huge financial problem hidden in the middle of all of this."
Yeah, so they put them in the ghetto, and then they scapegoat the people in the ghetto. What, they have to wear armbands soon?
Well, the government of the UK is going to spend up to £4,000 per family, and they're basically going to train them to forget their dreadful backgrounds, as they call them, their dreadful backgrounds.
Well, for £4,000 a family, as I explained last week, for £400 a family, you can give them a broker's license, have them work for Barclays, and become millionaires and support terrorism. This is what I hate about David Cameron's government. He's such a duplicitous schmata. I mean, here you have people who are proving themselves good at looting, you know, out there looting from the local stores for packs of cigarettes. They're the perfect candidates to work at Barclays, and you say they need to go to the ghetto, wear the armband, and be shuffled off into their forever good night. Whereas the people who are living in Barclays Bank, you somehow give them more subsidies and saying, well, these are the people that I believe are the good folks working to perpetuate the myth of greater British values and that we need to salute them. I mean, give the people a break. You're speaking out of both sides of your mouth. You're a horrible leader. You subsidize terrorism, just like Tony Blair subsidized terrorism with Saudi Prince Bandar, if you recall, according to the FT. He subsidized them, and the Saudi prince said to Tony Blair in his office, if you don't stop this a serious fraud investigation on me, they can't guarantee another 7/7 bus bombing.
Well, again, Max, here it is. The government of the UK, David Cameron's government, is calling these poor people. He's telling them, you little poor people, you on food stamps, you living in public housing, you have dreadful backgrounds. And because of this, we're sending you to this camp where we're teaching you how to have respect for other people. What has he done? What is he doing to save the people from the dreadful backgrounds of Bob Diamond, the dreadful backgrounds of Jamie Dimon? Jamie Dimon has bankrupted Montgomery County, Alabama. He has destroyed several cities in Italy. He has destroyed the municipal bond market across America. What about his dreadful background?
Right. 60 years ago, David Cameron would call for ethnic cleansing. Now he's just calling for getting rid of the dreadful backgrounds. Oh, how British.
Exactly. So here's the next headline on this. London's self-regulatory system proves illusory in LIBOR scandal. As we know, they were unable to self-regulate. Again, despite all of this long track record of banking crimes, they're still self-regulating. These poor people, already living in a ghetto out in the middle of nowhere, are sent a nanny, the respect czar, who has to oversee them and spank them and paddle them every day. David Kotak, who manages about $2 billion as a chief investment officer at Cumberland Investors in Sarasota, Florida, said, as a company, we now avoid London. It's tarnished. Passing the buck to others, shirking responsibility, and avoiding accountability characterizes the people at work there. So this is the way Cameron should be talking about not the poor people, but the people in the city of London.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's a regulatory cesspool that he believes is the key toward growth in the future by letting banks continue to rape and pillage, as you've just described, as is now obvious, whether it's HSBC or Barclays or any other of these financial serial terrorists. And he, of course, it's ironic because, of course, he would be the one who would enjoy being paddled.
Exactly. Now, Niall Ferguson, the Harvard University professor who was there to apologize for all of Donald Rumsfeld's invasions into countries around the world, he is quoted in this article saying, he warns the UK should be wary of imposing too many curbs on business. Financial services are the UK's largest export, he says, and pay 12% of the country's tax receipts. Banks are on the receiving end of a raft of financial regulation that is killing their business model.
Look, bankers caused 9/11, bankers caused the next 9/11, and the 9/11 after that. Until you get rid of the bankers, you're in trouble. All right, Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Kaiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way. Stay right there. Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to go to San Francisco and talk with Wolf Richter of the Testosterone Pit, where truth comes home to roost. Wolf is author of Big Like, Cascade into an Odyssey, and has been involved in business and finance for over 20 years. Wolf, welcome to the Kaiser Report.
Well, thank you for having me, Max.
All right, Wolf Richter, you recently wrote about the fact that the wine bubble has burst. This is what caught my eye, because a lot of these alternative markets and indexes are out there, and they reflect different aspects of the economy, and they're used to glean information about which way things are going, and the wine index is probably not well understood. Now tell us about the wine bubble, and then what these constant bubbles tell us about the overall global economy. So speak to the fact that we're into this serial bubble economy.
Right. A bubble occurs because there's too much money out there chasing too few assets, and so they plow into a new asset class like wines. And we've had the China bubble going on forever, so the Chinese have become wealthy. Federal Reserve and other central banks have printed lots of money, and so one bubble after another occurred. In 2005, it was wines that took off, and they took off seriously. These are wines that are traded heavily, so the 5 top brands of Bordeaux that are in that index, and there's another index that has 100 wines in it, and they jump by 250% over several years, and these are wines that are used for collecting, as an asset. You don't drink these wines. You put them in a refrigerated vault, and you save them for 10 years, and you try to make lots of money selling them. And so these wines reached their recent peak, their all-time high probably, in June, July last year, and they have now collapsed by 33% approximately, and it appears to continue. Right now, Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve, recently testifying, was saying, oh, he's got clippings, some editorials from 2008 about the risk of inflation. Where did that go?
But if you look at that wine bubble, you see clearly there's this hot money that chases indexes and markets around the world, distorts it, in many cases causes complete mayhem in those underlying economies, results in dislocations, misallocation, and huge economic problems, and then moves on to something else. Your thoughts?
Well, exactly, and we don't count asset bubbles in our inflation figures. So when wines, these collector wines, when they jump by 200%, that doesn't enter into the calculation of inflation. That's an increase in an asset price. So it's not figured into the number. So when we have a 200% uptick in one of these items, that doesn't impact our rate of inflation.
Right, so Bernanke is printing money to save the banks, and the money goes into wine. It goes in, as we see with the wine index, it goes into fine art, with hundreds of millions of dollars being paid for works of art. It goes into chateaus. In Germany, they're buying collectors' cars. The price of a Mercedes collector car went from $350,000 5 years ago to over $1 million today. So all Bernanke and these central banks are doing is flooding the top 1% of the top 1% with asset increasing money printing. And then he goes in front of Congress and says, well, wages aren't up, and people are starving in the street, which I created, and we're pushing them into ghettos, so there's no inflation.
Right. And as we have seen with the collapse of the housing bubble in the United States and with jobs, all that money that went into the markets actually haven't done anything for housing, and it hasn't done anything for the job market. We've had a mild recovery in jobs, a just minuscule mild recovery after many, many years of a complete job depression. And if you look out here in California, our unemployment rate is still double digits, the official one. The unofficial one is much higher. And so all that money flooding the markets hasn't done anything for the real economy, but it has created lots of bubbles cascading around the world.
Right. And not only does it create bubbles, but it creates the ability for market makers and bankers to artificially suppress prices of things that they don't want to go up in value as part of their overall market manipulation schemes. We see it with the LIBOR scandal and, of course, interest rate suppression and manipulation around the world. We see this in the energy prices. Price of oil is constantly being whipped around, 147 down to 40 or 50, back over 100, down to 60, purely for the benefit of the banksters, as the Economist magazine calls these terrorists. You recently have been writing about natural gas, where endless money goes to die. You say the price of natural gas has been below the cost of production for years. So walk us through that.
Well, natural gas is, in the United States, is one of the few commodities that hasn't experienced a bubble. What has happened is a lot of money, a lot of that free money that got printed had to be invested. And so part of where it got invested was natural gas drilling. And it caused an overproduction of natural gas in a commodity that is essentially landlocked. So if there's an overproduction, you can't export it, and the prices collapse. Well, it collapsed a long time ago, several years ago, and natural gas drilling is done with borrowed money generally. So the banks have been willing to lend, and that money has now evaporated. It's capital destruction, and the money is gone. The gas is cheap. The wells will never produce enough money to pay back those loans, and the natural gas industry is now in complete disarray in the United States.
Right, and the loans, the liabilities, just build up on the balance sheets of the companies, right, or the federal government, or in the shadow banking system, hundreds of trillions of dollars of derivatives, and as long as they can manipulate interest rates and keep rates near NIRP, with negative interest rate policy, 0% interest rate policy, it doesn't matter, no matter how much manipulation they're involved with, no matter how many people die as a result of Bernanke and the central bankers' terrorism. Now let's talk about this endless money that's been flowing into the bond markets. We see negative interest rate policies, NIRP, on several bonds around the world. What money is going into bonds to die? How do you see this wealth sacrifice playing out, Wolf?
Well, I have been watching Japan for close to 20 years. And I think Japan is different than any other place, but it's also a model, I think, for many of the Western economies. And what we see there is an effort by central banks to produce essentially free money so that their government can borrow endless amounts to run a deficit that is otherwise completely unsustainable. So in Japan, for example, the deficit has now reached, or the public debt has now reached 230% of GDP, and 53% of the entire budget this year is borrowed money. And they can do that because their 10-year bonds, the JGBs, are yielding right now below 1%. So for 10-year money, you're getting 0.7 or 0.8% return. It's essentially free, and so the government borrows essentially for free, and that's why central banks do that. And of course, it can't run forever. At some point, it's finished. At some point, it's over.
Right, and these commodity brokerage accounts, whether it's MF Global or now Peregrine, when they run out of fraud to engage with on some superficial level, they just steal customer money. So Peregrine has stolen $200 million. MF Global, JP Morgan stole over $1 billion. So you see that as a growing trend. It's just brokerage accounts and commodity brokers just stealing people's money as the ability to suppress interest rates using financial accounting, trickery, and terrorism plays out.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have had this problem for a long time that people's money has been stolen in the financial industry, and governments have tried to put in some rules. The rules have been watered down, and this is an ongoing issue. It's an issue in Japan. They had a pension fund collapse there with $2 billion evaporating, and it's an issue in Europe. It's an issue in the United States. There's a lot of money out there and a lot of reckless people, and it's usually the little people with their small investments that end up holding the bag.
Yeah, it's amazing in the UK or America. If somebody gets their garden gnome stolen, they'll report it to the police and shoot the guy dead. But if you steal their $1 million pension, they go, well, I guess it's the market.
That's right.
It's okay. It's just steal it all. So it's in that stupidity arbitrage, I would call it, between not knowing the value of a garden gnome and $1 million pension that the terrorists like Bernanke thrive. Now, in London, New York, and Chicago, if they actually stop the fraud, the theft, the larceny, the interest rate rigging, the forging of documents, the pilfering of client accounts, how much of a hit to the economy would it take? Because fraud has become the de facto business model.
That certainly is an interesting question. You know, if you take fraud out of the economy, it's like if you take the mafia out of Italy's economy, what would be left? I mean, how much of a hit would it be to the economy? And you know, I don't know who has any numbers on that, but it is part of the economy.
Right. So you've got a kind of a mix between the Italian mafia and the Japanese debt ratios around the world. That's the worst of all possible worlds, but the political leaders want to get reelected based on their track record of creating this zombie world economy that places zero cost on things like Fukushima, the drought in the U.S., the flooding, or any other AGW-related catastrophes that they're responsible for. Now let's talk about France for a second. France debt is yielding near zero. They're about ready to go into the NERP club, the lowest ever. Will this prevent the collapse of French banks, which are riddled with billions, if not trillions, of bad debts and fake derivative contracts?
Well, if you give a bank enough money, it essentially can't collapse. And that's what's been happening so far. They have gotten lots of money from the central banks, and if there is enough money to back everything up, if there's a crisis of confidence, that money comes out and solves the crisis of confidence. So yeah, there has to be a point. That's why the U.S. banks didn't collapse, because they got trillions of dollars, and it wasn't TARP, it was the Fed. TARP is just peanuts. That was $700 billion. What the Fed did was trillions. And in Europe, it's playing out that way. The French banks have already received, like late last year, earlier this year, lots of money. and they will continue to receive it if they need to. And the German banks are the same thing. Deutsche Bank is just as leveraged, is probably the most leveraged bank in Europe, in the world perhaps, and a huge bank. And of course, the Germans are very worried about Deutsche Bank, and they will try to keep it afloat with free money.
Right, 60-to-1 leverage at Deutsche Bank. All right, Wolf Richter, that's all the time we have for on the Kaiser Report. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Wolf Richter of the Testosterone Pit. If you want to send me an email, please do so at kaiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Kaiser saying bye, y'all.